Hi, guys.
Hello, everybody, one and all, to another wonderful Tuesday. We're starting off the Tuesday stream day with Terran Tuesdays. We got a magnificent guest host today, Maji-Chan. How are you doing today, Maji?
I'm doing all right. How about you?
I'm doing great. Black Knight and I were having an editing day today. He was editing his own stuff. I was editing a bunch of videos to try to get a bunch of stuff done for the upcoming holiday seasons. We got a variety of releases coming out, and that was actually something that kind of sparked today's topic, which is horror in media, basically the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what it's all about. But let's hear what you guys have been up to. Black Knight, what exactly have you been editing today?
I've been editing parts of my new book, the latest in the Star Shuttle series, like book 8. And I stumbled into something that I had forgotten.
Oh no!
I was reading my notes, and I have editing notes, which I have to write editing notes because I often have problems with my memory and I forget things. So
Me too.
I read the note. I checked for something. I discovered it, and do you know what happened?
What?
I was actually trying to edit something which wasn't wrong.
What?
Yes.
A bit of over editing. So.
Oh yeah.
Oh no!
So I had to go back and recheck like 17 chapters back.
Oh my gosh!
But thankfully, the damage was minimal, and I corrected it. I fixed it.
Yay!
Not bad. Yeah, just those small tweaks completely can ruin an entire
Oh, yeah.
novel, I could imagine.
Yeah.
But
And
how
that
about you?
Yeah.
But how about you, Maji-Chan? How's your day going?
Well, good. I had literary coaching with Daniel, since I'm working on the book this morning. For those of you who don't know, Daniel P. Riley is not only a indie editor, but he also offers writing lessons if you're not the strongest writer or your stuff sounds really like bad fanfic. Mwah. But he helps you get to the next level so that your readers can enjoy your work a little bit better.
Not bad,
So-
not bad. It's always good to get extra help on that stuff.
Oh yeah, and it's been a night and day difference. Like if you take a look at what Snow and Black Knight both know, they've seen my alpha copy. I thought they were beta, but no, it was my alpha. And if you compare the alpha draft to what I have now, it is a completely different thing, and it's just because I've been learning how to write better. Black Knight put a lot of notes into it.
Yeah. I think I wrote over 300 notes, maybe
Mhm.
more.
Decent.
A lot
That's a
of
decent
notes.
amount of notes. That's going to definitely come in handy there in the editing process. It's quite the journey.
Yeah.
But all right, Snow, your day. How's your day coming along?
And she put me last because I always have this giant long thing that I have to say. Okay, so you know that I'm doing because I've even posted it like I love DH because he said this morning. He was talking about my book. He was saying I'm a happy little dumpster fire, and I got to thinking about the first. I literally, my life is a dumpster fire. I actually have a tiny stuffed dumpster fire. This is a smiling, cute dumpster fire that I have for my trinkets and things because it fits my life so perfectly. And so I'm getting ready for my son's wedding. We're building this house. I figured out it's the itty bitty bunker of bodaciousness. And so it's little tiny, like a Quonset. That thing is so small. You can put it in your purse nearly, but it's still hard to work on it. So we had to do all that. And in the middle of all this, I'm editing. So I got my first, I basically sent in like a rough draft and a half, or like a first draft and a half, I guess, because this book has been interrupted by everything. It's been interrupted by major life-changing accidents and then it was interrupted by a death in the family. I had a heart attack. I had all this stuff. And so I wrote this whole thing, and I'm like, I know stuff is missing. So I usually turn in my first draft as being sort of it's an overview. Usually it'll be the basic story. And the last thing I usually put in is the emotional parts or the tweaking, the characters' inner voices, things like that. The reason why is because sometimes people read it and they get it. Other times there's some people that go, I don't understand what's happening. And that's when you want to add in a little bit to it. So I try not to over explain those things because I have a tendency to lore dump like on lore just in particular. I love lore. People who like lore like my books usually. And then that's why Blaine Pardoe liked it. People that like Warhammer or Battletech usually love it. But then there are other people that want more of the emotional part. So I got my first edit and my editor, she is absolutely adorable. She's actually Stephen Black's my editor, but he has a new assistant, and she read it. It's her first time to read any of the books. Well, we're 9 books in. This is like jumping in on the middle of a soap opera where you don't know what anything is or what is going on. So it's a really unique perspective because she doesn't have that. So I'm like, okay, I know I have to put in these inner voices. So now I'm writing in my main character's voice because he doesn't actually talk in the book. So I always put him last. And when he needs to explain something, because he can't really speak unless he has assistive devices or he has someone to help him. And he doesn't get to say everything he wants to say. So he's very introverted in the way he thinks. So I'm having to go back and just fill in the blanks of what he's thinking so he can explain where he is. And so some of the characters that Daniel P. Riley read my this draft of it and was really good with. I mean, as far as I know, he liked it. He was as far as I know, because he usually concentrates on the craft itself. He really didn't see any issues with it. He was like, hey, this is great. And then he also, though, knows about the series. He's read Trail of Travail. He's read other books. It's so different to have your edit go to a person that they really don't know the background on it. And you get to see the characters as a first-time reader sees them, where they are, and it really hones your craft. So it means I'm in the middle of doing this edit right now. So I think this is the perfect segue for horror because editing a book can be like a horror. It's literally, I have one of my my little friends online, Hope Adriana, and she's actually going to be my in-law soon. She's going to be a writer-in-law, and she's married. Her little sister is marrying my son, and so she was talking to me about just how terrible it is to go out and edit. When you tear out something, it feels like you're ripping it out with a seam ripper. And I feel like, yes, it is. It's so hard. It can be so horrible to go, oh, I've got to let go of this beautiful part of a story that I'm tearing it out, just ripping its heart out. And you really have to go back to yourself as a writer. Is this necessary? Is this really what's needed for the story to go on? Or can I put it somewhere else, maybe at another time? Is it necessary? But we love our stuff. It is like taking a piece of your heart out when you have to edit something. So I think that's the perfect way to start off on horror today.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely. And I brought up horror as a possible subject because we didn't necessarily have one set up last week, and it's sort of a last minute thing. But Black Knight, you seem quite excited to talk about horror. And, it's horror multimedia and how it affects us, how we see the horror genre today. And why were you so excited to talk about this one?
I was perhaps overexcited because I'm not completely insane over horror, but I do love writing all kinds of horror elements into my stories, and of course my book series. Those who read it, they know that it is a universe with like a lot of horror. It might be the little horrors of everyday survival. Might be the horror of some invader, or the ominous presence of something unseen, or something which is out there lurking and you have no idea when you'll bump into it. and then that fear, that terror, keeps you awake at night and sweating in the day, even though in space, day and night, it's relative. But yes, I probably one of my most favorite type of horror is the psychological horror, the unseen horror that it doesn't have. Um, it's not a monster that you can see, but you can feel it and it affects you. And also, I would say that probably the best and the most relatable kind of horror is a horror which can be, albeit really really hard, it can be defeated somehow. It might be impossible for you, might, yeah, it might end you, but maybe before your demise you will understand that had you done something else, you could have survived that horror. And in modern day media, we often see these like half baked, half thought out, poorly thought out horrors, which you actually, they're not quite horrible. They resort to cheap jump scare tactics, and they show you. And if it's a monster, they show you the monster straight away, like the fifth minute of the movie. You know how the monster looks like. Or they overuse some existential, cosmic level horror. They cram it everywhere, and then it cheapens it. It's not that mysterious. The mystery is gone, and a huge part of the mystery of especially something ancient and something unimaginably powerful, something that transcends space, and doesn't care about the pitiful walls of your home, or your planet, or your solar system for that matter. And if you overuse it, if you lift even part of the veil, it kind of cheapens it. Yeah. So that's my intro.
Not bad, not bad. Maji, what's your opinion on horror?
Okay, so I kind of flashed these earlier. So these were the start of my reading journey when I was a kid. That and comics. The Scary Story series. They've been around forever, and then they got banned because they were too inappropriate, and then they came back because of the movie.
Is that the R.L. Stein? Is that the R.L. Stein ones? Or
No. These ones are just a bunch of short little pulps by Alvin Schwartz.
Oh, okay.
Some of them are based off of like old lore, and some of them are just little written ones that he did. I mean, they were kids' stories, but so they're not really that scary as an adult. But when you're a kid, man, they were intense.
Oh, yeah.
But between that, Goosebumps, no wonder why one of my favorite books of all time is Frankenstein.
Oh yeah.
So, James said horror, and I'm like, really? But I like the old school horror. I'm not so much into the slashers and the berserk manga, stuff like that. I like the ones that more mess with your mind, ones that more question, like Frankenstein, where it questions where's the definition between God and man, and his creature and stuff like that. So
that's also a good one, Frankenstein, because that's one you really don't get too much of. Is it's kind of like Mac Thompson mentioned here, the best oldest fear is fear of the unknown, what lurks in the depth. I believe that to be a half truth, because I believe the fear of the known can be just as frightening And that's kind of what Frankenstein is. The monster tells Victor Frankenstein exactly what he's going to do if he denies him. And then he denies the monster. And everything he told him plays out. And all of that is captivating fear. But I also believe it adds in a separate element, which the unknown doesn't really provide you. And I believe that would be, in a sense, a thrill. It's a bit of a thriller, because what I think it was Kubrick who said that a thriller is something that you know, but the character doesn't, or something that is currently happening where somebody knows and others around him do not. And that is essentially the Frankenstein tale once you get to that certain portion, because that's what I call like a multi-layered book of fear, because it's not only the fear of this monster coming at you, it's also the fear of this untouched soul that came from a beastly place and was transformed into a beast in itself, and then took vengeance on the very creator that brought him to life. It's a magnificent tale, and actually one of my favorite horrors. But R.H. Snow, I know you got a lot to talk about, so why don't you go?
I'll ask after Snow. I'll ask the question I had for Maji-Chan.
Yeah, no, go ahead and ask Maji if you want to.
No. It's your turn. It's your turn.
What? Okay, fine. I want it on record. They asked me to talk. I'm sitting here just being good. I'm actually doing my notes. Okay, so for me, let's go back a little bit on that history of horror. And first of all, horror is a necessary element of life. Much like the introduction of suffering, and we talk about how last week went back to the ancient epics of Gilgamesh. Literally, it starts with the gods and monsters and the world around us, and how we can't explain everything, and these terrible things happening to good people and bad people. The world is sometimes a very horrifying place. This belongs in our culture. It belongs in our movies and our literature, because we need to learn to deal with it. One of the ways that we first encounter the horrors of the real world is by encountering it through stories and literature. As children, we are introduced to the fact that the world can be a terrible place. One of the reasons why a lot of people are afraid to let children read certain amount of times of horror is because they don't want them to be in despair. And what they don't realize is that we actually crave it. Like testing ourselves for being a hero. The hero must be able to face horror, whether male or female or old or young. They have to be able to face horror. It's a common trope, actually, in horror that the oldest person in the room is the one that's the least frightened. Why? Because they've seen the most. It's the younger people who don't yet know how to deal with it that are the most terrified. They're sometimes the most easily overcome by the monster because they don't yet know what to do. They haven't encountered horror in their lives, and it can defeat us. So the introduction of horror to children, to people that are not used to it, is a very important element. It's the reason we crave it. It is part of danger. Danger itself, just knowing that there's a bullet out there with your name on it, can be very terrifying. Anybody who's ever been to war knows this. But now we add in the additional element. What if somebody's hunting you? What if somebody's actually after you? What if somebody's stalking you through the woods? What if somebody's trying to find you or break in your house? These are elements of horror that are closely associated with real life for many people. How do we learn about it? We learn about it through our stories. And so we go back to, how did people originally introduce horror? How did they do it as a fun thing, sort of, and at the same time to be educational? Well, in a world without books, you had primarily storytelling. And so we have the epics, we have Gilgamesh, we have the monster tales of the Incas, we have other stories that are out there that are about these terrible elements of the natural world around them arising, and especially in Norse mythology, the frost giants and things like this. These are elements of horror that we sometimes don't really talk about, whether it's in Greek mythology or otherwise. These tales of monstrous beings that seek to crush smaller or weaker people, and how the hero is supposed to face them. The Minotaur, for instance, in Greek mythology. How does Theseus go about trying to defeat him? How does Prometheus deal with the horror of his liver being eaten every day by the vultures that surround him? How does Sisyphus deal with the horror of being tormented for the rest of his life, being forced to push a big boulder up a mountain and never be able to stop his job. These things are horror. And so we go forward into Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is actually is two things. It is a religious text, but it's also a series of just absolutely terrible tales of torment, of people that were tortured certain ways. And people would read this and be terrified. At the same time, they're learning religious stories. So they actually got to talk about these terrible ways that people would die, gruesome. This is part of where our gruesome horror comes in. Body horror and torture being part of that turns into Michael Myers series of Halloween or the Texas Chainsaw Massacres or any of those things, Freddy Krueger. These are those torturing elements that we see in our horror today. And then, of course, we have the monstrous undead of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Stoker's Dracula itself, when you read it, there is that element of the psychological horror that is there. And this is where it starts to segue into the knowns and unknowns. What we don't know can be terrifying as much as what we see in front of us. It's not really the body lying there. It may culminate in that, but it's the unknown. Why is this person so terrifying? What is unnatural about them? Why does evil feel so bad? Then we move forward into that modern age of the terrifying. The world around us may look normal. We have a comfy apartment and it's got the lights on and there's food in the refrigerator. And people would have thought of this as a palace back in the days. But there are things just beyond our sight. There's monsters outside the door now. Somebody's going to try to break in or there's going to be a murder or something like that. And these are elements of the true crime horror that shows up now a lot. And it comes out in our more fantastic horror, too. For instance, in The Sixth Sense by M. Night Shyamalan, where we have that unseen element that we can't quite put our finger on. Why was something not right? What's wrong? And that element creeping into the picture defines most modern horror, with the exception, of course, of the gore fest, which is a different, type of horror, still important. But we long for these things throughout human history. We long for horror because it teaches us how to deal with horror on our own, in our own way, in our own lives. And so that's why we crave it so much. We need this in our lives. We need it to help guide us because eventually, no matter who you are, you're going to run into horror in your real life. And this is where we learn to face it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're cool. Go. You're fine. I'm done.
Well, not only that, but like a lot of the Disney fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm stories, those were all originally horror stories.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's on my
they
list.
softened them up.
Have you read the old Slavic fairy tales? They oh boy, you have talking skulls, cutting, like slicing humans, etc., etc. It's full of it. Like, but the character of Baba Yaga herself is beyond, and she's perhaps one of the most famous characters from the Slavic folklore. But most people do not know about the Koshchei the Immortal, the Deathless Koshchei the Deathless, who is actually the first and probably the most powerful lich slash Death Knight of the Slavic folklore. But yeah, it's and as someone who studied different folk tales from across the world, every area of the world has its quite insanely horrifying creatures and spirits and demons, and some of them are quite similar, by the way. I am not aware if you know that the archetypal monster that comes and steals children away and puts them in a sack, which in the Slavic
Oh yeah.
folk tales it's called turbalan. It exists in some form all over the world.
Yes,
So,
it actually it when we look at that, whether it's the voice and I talked about my father talking about the voice in the woods that will lure you away, the green man who tries to take you away from what is familiar and into the unknown. The child stealer is common to almost all cultures. It's the one that comes and your child is just gone, and that's that story of what happens. This thing will come and take you. You should warn somebody. You should say something. You should do something. Children are told about this entity throughout the world and how to avoid this thing. There's usually a way out somewhere in the story. There's a way to trick it. There's a way to stop it. Usually this happens when nobody's looking. In fact, a lot of the changeling stories from Ireland and Scotland have to do with a mother is not right there at the crib side. They leave the baby in there to do something else. And this, of course, becomes a morality tale to young parents. Don't leave your baby for a long period of time. And so you have these sort of interwoven with practical matters. You also have stories about what might be threatening you out there. And I think that's why the child, was it the child catcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang? If you've ever watched it, it's one of the most horrifying parts of a child's movie ever, is the child catcher coming out to basically to do what we're talking about here, to lure a child into something that looks good, and then he steals them away. And this is such a common theme, and you almost wonder, why is it so universal? I guess because we really do fear somebody not only taking our children when they belong to us, but as a child being taken away. You're a small, relatively defenseless person. Being taught to fight back is not something we necessarily do with our children unless we are confronted with these tales.
I think I need to share a story about this this entity with the sack that steals children. And I learned it.
Uh-huh.
I learned it long ago, shortly after I left the army, and I met a guy who was friend with an older guy who actually served as a mercenary in Vietnam, and he wasn't like in any real long protracted war or anything, but he heard a lot of stories there. So that kind of knowledge, I am somewhat hesitant to take everything as at face value. But in this case, it carries similarities with many different other stories that I know. So it is quite short, but what happened is that during the Vietnam War, there was an experiment. The CIA, they had these special troops go deep in the jungle with sound equipment. I'm not sure if you heard about it, but they would record creepy voices and sounds and just run the tapes for months in the night, because they knew that the Viet Cong were superstitious, and they would try to mess with their minds. I checked. This is the actual part that you can check and verify that it actually happened, that there was a real operation like that. So this guy, the one who told him that story, he was Vietnamese, and he was a doctor. He went to the Soviet Union to study and came back to Vietnam to help. So one day, some young soldier comes to him. They carry him. He's like, he has no eyes. He assumes that it's just an injury, maybe shrapnel, maybe whatever. And they tell him that this soldier actually he gouged his own eyes. Why? Because his unit, they were trying to set up an ambush in the jungles, and they one by one they got snatched by something. And at first they assumed that it's probably the American Green Berets, the commandos, and then there were cases when they would bump into like some American special ops unit, and the special ops would devastate them, and very few would escape. So they at first they assumed it was a normal enemy, but one of them saw a tall man with a huge sack in a club, and the man was over about I think he mentioned something 4 meters tall, and the sack was full of people, and he would shake it because they were wriggling inside. They were trying to get out, and there were the screams coming from the sack. And the sack would contract on itself and crush those who were inside, and their screams would end, and the sack would leave like a huge trail of gore and blood. And this soldier saw that thing, and he used his AK-47 and a grenade, and this thing completely ignored him. He just walked away while soaking the bullets and the blast wound of the grenade, and just walked away. And it stopped. Its head twisted back at an unnatural angle, and it looked at him, and this is why he gouged his eyes, because he everywhere he in every dark corner, every shadow, he would see the face of that thing, and he went mad. So
Oh my gosh, that's a terrible story.
yeah, it's something that is partially it's partially aligned with different other similar stories from other parts of the world, and from a folklorist standpoint of view like me, it's quite interesting piece of research. So I'm not going to give that other perspective that I have, because it's YouTube. So
Well,
and the question that I wanted to ask Maji-Chan was, what is your favorite horror in Star Shutter?
I didn't really get any horror in Star Shatter, but that's just me. At least not that I've read so far. I'm trying to think.
Did you read the anthology collection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read the anthology, but I didn't think it was horror. Granted, I wasn't reading it like a kid would see it horror either, though.
I look at it. I think the battlefield horror is where it is. It's actually the memories and the way it affects the characters. I think of that as horror. That's just me, though.
Yeah, that's one of the horror elements. Yeah, the unlife is
gotcha.
um, and there are multiple tiny horrors, the everyday horrors, which if you think about it, like the more you think about them, the more you will notice them. They are sprinkled throughout the books, and you can find them in their conversations, even when they talk about or one thing or another thing that happened, or they think of events that would happen. And because that's that part that James mentioned, the fear of the known, because they've already experienced it, or they know people who have experienced it, and they are certain that it will happen. It's just the uncertainty is when it will happen. The thing is that it will happen. It's inevitable to happen, but the uncertainty comes from the fact that you don't know when.
Definitely, and in the midst of this, because we're talking about, what makes a good horror, the things we like about horror. And there's a handful of stuff in the modern era that I don't think we've ever seen so much horror being produced in a lot of facets, from the written literatures to movies. And, my favorites are always the audio horrors that you'll find on YouTube and such. And I don't think I've ever consumed so much terrible stories in a single genre than when it comes to horror. Because it does kind of come off like an entry level genre, so to say. Though, like all genres, there's masterful stories found throughout them. But man, it's like almost every single writer that explores horror, like an aspect of horror, I think that makes a good horror writer is kind of the thing we touched on throughout this, and that's actually knowing fear yourself, actually experiencing bits of fear. Because if we look throughout the horror writers throughout the era who have inspired people, they were all really afraid in one way or another, or it all had to come in contact with fear. And there's so much writers who write in horror where I don't believe that they've ever been that afraid before, or they just need some help getting that fear in the appropriate context or prose. Because a lot of it, I hate to say, it's a fear. Horror is supposed to be that gripping unknown fear within you, that continuous tension. But so much of it has laid flat because it's so cliche. Like if I look at if I'm looking at a list of horror stories and I come across say it's written in the last 5 years, a nautical horror story, there's like an 8 out of 10 chance I can tell you what the first paragraph's going to say. Anybody who's kind of read one can kind of tell you what the first paragraph of a nautical horror story in the modern era is going to say. And it's going to be the same stuff of we don't really know what's in the deep. There's X amount of percentage of the ocean that's never been explored. More about this, like
the creepypastas.
Yes, and it gets if there's a way, here you go, how not to write a horror story. Fill it full of cliches, so that way it's just flat and your readers can guess what happens next. So for me, as somebody who's been consuming a lot of horror lately, there's nothing that kills tension more than the cliche. And it's almost to the point where you can point at a popular form of horror, and I could probably tell you how the story's going to end if you just give me the beginning plot points of it. And that's kind of where we are right now. I'm waiting for some, and I'm sure there are some out there, magnificent horror writers. Because I think, like I said, if you lived, you can write, and if you've known fear, if you've known pain, you can write horror. You just need to capture that. And there's not enough people out there who've who lived the fear they're trying to write about, which a lot of it is actually Lovecraftian in nature. It's get a lot of Lovecraftian vibes, but Lovecraft was so afraid as a human being. He was actually quite crippled by it, you know. So I think that's where a lot of the Lovecraftian cliches come from. It's less about what people are afraid of and more about what Lovecraft might have been afraid of.
I think that's what the real problem is. I think that we have a tendency to read it and it so enthralls us that we imitate it. We're taking someone else's fear, though, and you can do that if you're very good at it. That's awesome. But we're missing out on our own fears. We're missing out on, and if our own fears are translated properly, a horror story is based on the emotion of the person telling the story. It is literally a chance for us to viscerally live vicariously through another person. And as a result, you have to have some, you're right, the author has to know what that emotion feels like on their own. We're missing out if it only imitates Lovecraft's ideal or Dracula's ideal. It has to be the author's own experience, not just of reading a story about something horrible, but of actually living something and translating that fear into the story. That's when it becomes truly great. Everything else is good or a romp, but it's not necessarily greatness. And I think that's where we're kind of missing out in a lot of things, not just horror, but in everything in general. We have people writing romance, that they're actually writing romances about romance stories they've read. They've actually never experienced romance, but they are writing about what they think they might like based on a movie they saw. And
what you're just talking about is what we call touching the grass, not having touched the grass.
You haven't touched the grass.
Yeah, never touched the grass.
And we don't want to tell people, no, you shouldn't share your that experience you had. That horror that you feel from reading that story is real. You can't tell them to go out and experience that their own horror, but you have to go out in the world enough to know what is truly frightening. What is really frightening? And if it's simply the world within you, then write that world. But it has to be about you interacting with your surroundings. Even if some of the greatest horror stories are written in a 4x4 room. Why? Because you can't escape. The Pit and the Pendulum literally takes place all inside one room. It takes place inside one man's mind, inside one room. That the greatest horror is told from within a very small perspective sometimes. Not running through the woods from a giant monster, but instead escaping your own telltale heart, in the case of Edgar Allan Poe, one of the greatest horror writers of all time, and my first real introduction to true horror, terror, that psychological horror, that root of it, takes place in Poe's deepest addictions and alcoholism, his own feelings of sin and regret overwhelming him, to where you don't even have to have a monster. You can just have a raven sitting on a door, and it becomes horrifying, terrifying. It's that gothic feel. And once again, he would have totally missed it if he had just been trying to rewrite something from the past. If he had just written another fairy tale, it would not have had nearly the weight that it had of him simply telling the stories of suffering and struggle from addictions. That mental health journey that he had, it would eventually take his life. That horror is so aptly related, and he translates it in fantastical ways. We have to be able to touch our own spirit, what truly horrifies us, and we have to be able to somehow apply it to our own real world so we can make it real for our readers. So it's not just copying or imitating or retelling a story that somebody else told. It's not about you watching a movie, or it's about you being you and what terrifies you and horrifies you.
True. You know, it's like I've actually shot a gun before. You know how much that actually helps writing from a first person perspective of a character currently shooting a gun, and not only that, but let's say you feared, you've been there, and then you pick up a story that's supposed to take you there again, and it just falls flat. And that's because the reader is more experienced than the writer. Often I come into contact with that with literature. Like somebody was talking about, they were shooting Winchester, and then they had to reload the clip, the magazine. It's like, okay, anybody who shot a gun is going to be completely removed from the story. Fear can very well operate the same way, but you're dealing with a bit more abstract there, because fear is a pull on the emotion, a pull on the sensitive parts of a person's soul to make them feel uncomfortable, feel worried, feel constricted, feel in danger. And it's very easy, just as easy, to completely fall flat if the reader has more experience with fear than the writer does.
I actually ran into that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Really?
No. Talk about it, Maji.
So when I was writing my story, one of the characters gets practically impaled by a log.
Mhm.
And I mean, it
I remember that.
rips. It rips into his skin, tears off his flesh. Like, he gets fully impaled by this thing, just ripping him apart.
Yeah.
But the way I described it was very, very flat. It was very, okay, yeah, I could see it, but I couldn't capture the emotion because I can only visualize the wound. I didn't know what it felt like. And Daniel, he read that part and he's like, normally when you're doing coaching, he doesn't really take over. He's like, do you trust me? And I'm like, yeah, I trust you. And he rewrote it, and I was cringing, and I knew what was happening when he rewrote that little paragraph. The reason for that, I'm asking him, like, dude, that took me almost a month to do. Well, what the heck? He's like, yeah, but I've had that kind of wound before.
Yeah. It hurts.
It wasn't a log, but I've had stuff rip into me like that, so I know how bad it hurts. But I couldn't write from that perspective that he was able to add into it. Well, and I will fully admit that.
Yeah, that's when we go to somebody else. And in fact, I think that's what you went to Daniel and said, what's here? And we talked to people who have been there. If we have not been in that place, but part of the thing is knowing that we haven't been in that place, knowing that we haven't experienced it. Sometimes it's like trying to describe the color red to a person that's never seen anything. If I cannot see in the color shades of red, I couldn't describe it to you. But somebody would have to tell me, hey, you're colorblind. You really can't see that part. Let me help you describe red. Let me tell you what's red and what's not. And then I would go, okay, cool, because I actually have some color blindness in our family. And so I know that, then you go outside, you go, okay, what colors is this really? I'm seeing it one way, but you're actually seeing the full spectrum. So we go to those people. One of the best compliments I've gotten lately, and in Watcher the Damned, the horror is just this, it's a constant backdrop because there's so much death. And there are creatures that roam the world, and there are also creatures on two legs that roam the world. And as a result, there's these horrors of different kinds. And it's in the background usually until it usually rises up in a sort of an environmental way. But we have one particular scene that's actually a surgical scene. And I've done, as an EMT, I've been there when we've had really bad, gruesome scenes that happen. And I use that as part of a body horror type of thing. But I couldn't figure out how to do this one particular surgery and have the patient live. And we know how amputations, with this little bit of swallow, there's an amputation. And I thought, this is a perfect chance to do a little horror. We're going to do it. And so I talked to my cousin, who is actually a veterinarian. And I asked her, how do we deal with a wound that's right below the knee, let's say, or below the lower half of the shin? You've still got this much. And she says, well, you don't try to save that lower half. You take it off right below the knee. You cut into the healthy flesh, and you make basically a leg burrito is what you make. You fold the end over and you tie it down, and you'll use the glue in this. And we talked extensively about how this could be done under field conditions with the right sanitation. And so I wrote this scene, and not only do we have this terrible infection called the ooze that takes over the body and actually just liquefies it. And I have seen infections so bad, especially with older people that have diabetes, which is why we always say, please take care of your feet. Please let somebody else help you, because we've seen it. It's become so horrible. And the way to describe it, the smell and the emotions and people, not just what it looks like, but the people around it, what the experience they feel when you look at what used to be a foot and it is now just a mangled pulp. It's not just a bloody scene and you see it. what the little pieces of bone look like sticking out of pink skin. And you know this person, you've seen it just a few minutes ago. Their foot was normal. Now it's a crushed grinder of dirt and blood, and it's becoming infected, and you can't save this. How are you going to deal with this? And my editor, when she was reading it, became squeamish because I had described what I had seen in the field and had taken it to the next level because of the world and the infection that is where it's taking place. And that was such a great compliment to know that somebody else felt the way I felt the first time I saw a wound like this. And the effects that it has when you actually love this person and you know you're going to lose a part of them. You'll either lose all of them or you're going to at least lose a part of this person. And here's that part right here. You're holding it in your hands. And the toe falls off as you're holding them. And it doesn't sound like much, but you look down and here's this piece of a human. And you can't put it back. You can't fix it. That feeling has to come through. And it's telling the story from what we know. That experience, when you describe the horror that you feel. So let's say that you have a different kind of horror. There are horrors that go beyond the body, that go beyond monsters. One of the most horrible films, I'm saying from a person of horror, from a perspective of just absolute feelings of I didn't want to see the next frame. I was too afraid, but I had to watch it. It's actually a movie called AI. It was released in 2001. I had the little guy
with the Sixth Sense kid.
Yes, that's right. Haley Osment was actually, to me, a horror film. Why? The idea of being abandoned as a child, of running through groups of people that want to sexually exploit you or to destroy you, to take you out, and to be abandoned at the bottom of an ocean with the only person you ever loved, never contacting you ever again, never seeing you again, was so horrible. I couldn't watch it again. I almost rage quit it. I know it ended a different way. I said, this is the epitome of horror to me. Why? Because I can face a wound. I can look at a loved one dying. I can walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I cannot imagine dying alone by myself as an 8-year-old, knowing that no one ever loved me. That was the most horrifying thing I could think of. To each of us, our own horror is given. To each of us, we have something that terrifies us so much that we don't dare go there. That's where you have to go with your horror. That's where you have to go with the emotion. When you give that to your reader, when you let them experience what you're feeling, they will become a greater human because of it. They will learn what to not do to themselves and others by reading your story. You can humanize the horror and the suffering of people and create characters and stories that not only are terrifying and horrible, but also beautiful because they awaken the humanity in the reader.
I must say something, that this kind of horror, it's probably it comes from the fear of being abandoned and being completely alone, which is for us humans, since we are kind of a highly developed social sentient being, it's actually harmful to our psyche to be completely alone. It's very rare. There are rare individuals who are not fazed by it. They can go on for years, decades, but they are rare. So one of the probably, and I'm sharing the feedback that many of my readers shared with me. One of the most horrible things that they found in the Star Shattered universe as a whole was the depths of GNet, which is a multi-layered cyberspace that you can access by various means, and in the, let's say, the fullest way you can access it by jacking your brain to a system via piece of cyber gear called nerve gear. and what it does is that projects you inside the system. But the problem is that it projects part of your soul inside the system, and you can be taken. You can be taken, and then your body will be used by something or many things. And there are people and beings who were lost in this vast, almost nearly endless space, multi-layered space. And then these things, they have been alone for thousands upon thousands of years. They went, some of them, they went beyond what we assume to be madness. And you can imagine, you can try to imagine what will occur if one of these things, or many of them, find someone to take as their own new body.
Yeah. Sounds like parasitic weirdness. Ooh, that's another body horror thing for sure.
I think when it comes to body horror, I see it a lot as like horror of a portion of your mortality, almost like what you were touching on, Snow, where you see that those physical, biological pieces start to fail on you, start to get infected. I think that's what's at the core of body horror as a whole. And I think that's what horror is a continuous reminder of what you're vulnerable to and how it may be able to affect you. As some of the first horrors were written as warnings, warnings of the unknown, warnings of the beasts hidden in the jungle, warnings of those things that prowl at the night that actually will harm you and are out there. You may not know what they look like, but they're out there because you've seen what they've done. And I think that's what's missing a lot in horror as well. Is there's a lot less lessons in there. There's a lot less meaning, and a lot of it is kind of just there for the scares, there for the spookums, or there for the unknown. And a lot of those are also the ones that just completely fall flat as well. Is horror, the best of them, don't necessarily have a meaning behind them, but there's value found within them, because you have to be engrafted in it. And it's hard to be wholly engrafted by something that has little to other value other than, look, this is creepy.
Yeah. Has to evoke feelings. If it does not evoke any feeling at all, it, as you said, it feels flat.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, unfortunately.
Well, and I think,
Sadly.
well, when we
The
see that,
failure. I'll just say that the failure of the latest Alien movies, I think it's proof of that. Yeah, they kind of
Very uninspired.
Yeah, very uninspired. They don't feel like anything like the first two, which the first had its great, excellent monster horror and the inevitability of doom horror style, and then you had the second one, which you kind of had some way of trying to stop the horror, but it was never enough, and that's the always failing resistance against horror vibe or theme, which is also very beautiful, perfect when you make it, when you write it and you act it as they did. and that's what made the franchise so so um, compelling, and I think it inspired a great many authors and artists, and maybe even actors. I'm quite sure. But what they did in later years was rather bland. They had no, like, they didn't feel it. It was soulless, empty. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So
No,
yeah.
no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think so much of it, when the soul is missing, is because the whatever's creating these stories, whether it's sometimes you have a corporation, Larry, let's make a story about a blah blah blah. That's what happens in most of pop culture now. A corporation says, hey, let's tell a story, and that's one of the reasons they become soulless, because they don't have a one writer in charge of the process. They have a team of people, and sometimes that can turn out a fine product if the team has been working together long enough and they are really in sync with each other. But most of the time, it's just a group of people cobbled together to create a product. It becomes soulless. True horror has a soul. It has a spirit. When we look at this tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is unknown to a lot of modern readers, it really shouldn't be. It should be well known, because it is one of the first stories probably dealing with addiction and drug use from the author, who at the time may have been using cocaine and was actually in a very bad place in his life. He wakes up from a dream, and his friend rushes in. This is Robert Louis Stevenson. Wakes him up and says, why did you wake me? I was having the most wonderful, horrible dream. And he's dreaming this tale. And it is born of his own agony as his wife is sick and in bed, and he's trying to take care of her, and he's trying to take care of everything. And he's using drugs to help him get past all of this, like many of us do. In this case, cocaine was useful at that time and prescribed often by doctors. I have it in my grandfather's old books where you could prescribe cocaine for people that were depressed. And so here you have a story of a man who, when he is sober and he is well, he is this kind and gentle person. But when he's under the influence of this serum, he becomes this horrible creature that commits crimes, and nobody knows what's happening. And there's this thrill, not only to finding out who it is, but of the reader starting to figure it out as well, and to realize that the person that they love is actually the person they despise. This is one of the greatest of all horrors. It is not just body horror. It is a spiritual horror. Once again, the tale that tells a warning. But it is born not of a desire to preach to somebody, or to tell someone how bad they are, but instead of a desire to tell someone what's really happening to me. When I tell my tale as an author, when Stevenson approaches this work with such great fervor that he literally gets it done within a matter of days, and he perfects it over a period of weeks. And the novella becomes so incredible in Victorian times, because it accurately describes an aspect of Victoria that we really don't talk about, the Victorian drug addiction and alcoholism abuse epidemic that was occurring all around the world as people became able to afford and use drugs. This is a horror that can only be told by one who has experienced it in their own life, whether watching someone they love or actually becoming the monster themselves. This is the element of horror that is missing from so many tales. Some horror stories are a thrill ride. You go along because you want to see the gore and the action, and oh my gosh, this must be how it feels to be a person getting killed. There is a certain visceral element to it, but it still has to have an element of reality somewhere. It can't just be, I love watching people get killed. That's not horror then. That's just gratuitous violence. There has to be a horror to it. And that means there has to be a love for the subject. And the subject is actually, in horror, the subject is the author. It is the person who is experiencing the horror and telling us how to feel about it. And that means that you have to be there somehow in your own spirit. The horror of what is happening has to be evoked. And you can't do that unless you experienced it yourself somehow.
Yeah, or had a first-hand, someone who experienced it firsthand, and is good at conveying their emotion to you.
Indeed. And in fact, the book you were just talking about, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's probably also one of my favorite horror stories as well. And especially the ending kind of punctuates the absolute dreariness of that book of horror. And I'm not going to ruin it for anybody who hasn't actually checked it out. It's definitely worth it, and it's not that long of literature, and it's so much more memorable than a lot of the stuff I've been reading, because I'm going through like 4 or 5, maybe 6 horror stories a day sometimes, and I barely remember any of these. I barely remember them. They're all alike. They cover the exact same points, and a lot of them are kind of like they fall underneath the same trend. A lot of like action stories I used to read fall underneath, and that trend was wouldn't that be cool? But in this case, it's like, wouldn't that be scary? And I think the worst of them are kind of those that can't step away from the rules or the cliches of it all. Because if you think Lovecraftian stories are bad, Black Knight, or like aquatic stories, check out Wendigo stories.
Oh, yes,
Every single one of them is exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
You can guess the ending. You can guess everything.
Because for part of my research, I had to read a lot of them, and you are 100% correct.
And I get where that comes from, because the Wendigo is kind of like a mythological creature of legend, which has its set lore, and it has its kind of rules, for lack of a better terminology. But then somebody writes a Wendigo story, and they're so afraid to step away from the rules. And I think we've entered this point in multimedia, where we have radio, television, and the written word, and so much more, and even interactivity of video games, where I think it's time we step away from the rules, at least in the sense of horror, because I want to be scared again. It's rare that I come across that story that scares me. In fact, the last one that scared me, I wondered, why did this do it when all these others didn't? And it was because it truly had something unexpected. It gave a mystery of what was to come, and it didn't just unveil what was in the shadows immediately. It set forth a new journey in a place I wasn't familiar with before. It was actually a cosmic horror story, but then it was so close to Earth, so to say, and it was in space, yet very grounded, and you got introduced to all these different characters that would be affected by the end, and given all these small little bits, because that's what a cosmic story is, or a cosmic horror story is, the unknown. To some degree, it has to become known, to at least frighten you, to at least shake you. And for that, you have to leave breadcrumbs. You have to leave a type of mystery to follow. And when that mystery was unveiled and it got introduced to the big bad of the cosmic horror, it was something tangible. And I think that was where it broke the rules of cosmic horror. So that's been followed to a T. Is like, it's so mysterious where I'm no longer afraid of what's in the shadows. It introduced something that was beyond belief, beyond anything I could grasp with my hands, and was imaginable. I could imagine that happening. I could see that creature it was portraying. And in a sense, it sort of broke that cosmic horror rule of it has to remain beyond your mindset, which I believe was inappropriately written, because if you actually do read the master of cosmic horror, I should say the introducer of cosmic horror, which is H.P. Lovecraft, everybody assumes that you go crazy the moment you actually lay eyes on these creatures. But no, he actually added in an interesting rule is the more imaginative you are, the more sane you will remain when you actually look on one of these monsters, because unlike those who are non-imaginative, your imagination allows you to expand further beyond belief than those simply captivated by reality, if you will. So those who are more grounded, come in contact with these things, they're the ones that lose their minds. other people are broken in ways. They're shifted. Their mentality is shifted, but they can grasp reality. In some ways, they can still function. They can still be there. It's written in a number of his stories where one person comes out sane enough to tell the tale and doesn't completely lose it. And in a way that's been watered down and lost behind the unknown and the horror. So I would say, in the midst of all this rambling of terror, and I've been very frustrated with horror, if you're going to write cosmic horror, do not be afraid to show what people are afraid of, because as it is now, everything in cosmic horror is veiled behind the unimaginable. We can imagine it. In fact, it has to be imagined through the written word, and that's what makes it exciting. And that rule, I believe, needs to be broken to once again shake people into horror. Even, this may be a controversial thing to say, but it kind of hit me right here talking about breaking rules. Maybe it's time we leave some of the long-lasting and beloved aspects of horror behind in the more aesthetic form, not less like horror having a message, but horror having to be the unknown, or cosmic horror always having to have zero survivors and everybody just loses their mind. There's so much more that we've constrained ourselves with that we need to liberate horror from.
Yeah, it's for someone who I wrote bits of cosmic horror because it's in my universe it does exist. Things exist, but there is also that element that very I'm not sure how to even, let's say, it's wholesome horror. It's still horror, but with a different face, meaning that it's you may think that it's coming, it's something that's coming for you, but it's not actually coming for you. Well, that's perhaps not the best definition of it. Let's say that it's still a horrible horror. It's something that it's probably not known to you, or maybe it's vaguely known to you, but where others get ripped to pieces by it, you're not, and this horror is actually in temporary alliance with you. Well, that's just, let's say that's the vague definition of it. But I did write quite a lot of just horror in space, which is the pure nature of the biome. Space is deadly, and space is pretty much death. You're traversing death. Pretty much everything in space can kill you and will kill you. And it's where you can capitalize upon this known horror and all the ways that you know that horror can kill you, and that this is like an ever-stalking horror. You can't, this is your life. You can't escape this horror. You can't evade it. And in many ways, to survive and to assure the survival of your civilization, you have to constantly live with that horror. Otherwise, you will die. So basically, to survive, you need that horror. That horror has become life. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. Go ahead, Snow.
No, and actually, this is a common theme with humanity as well. The need for alliance with horror it is a constant companion. Somewhere out there, it's still dangerous, but it can kill you. This is we see it in our everyday lives where we're dealing with machines or things that could kill us, that could literally tear us apart, and yet we work right side by side with them. Had we the full grasp of how easily we can be killed in a car wreck, how easily we can be killed by machinery that we work with or a gun, we would not ever use one. As a result, we become sort of used to the horror. We learn to live with things that could hurt us or harm us. But being able to codify it by putting it into a story and giving it a different face. I know, James, you were talking about using a gun. And of course, I grew up with guns. I work with guns. My family works with guns. We have, because we're an agency, that's why we make our living. And so we have these things in the house. And if I was terrified of them, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. But more terrifying to me was the one time I didn't have a gun and a man was standing outside my window and I was taking a bath and I had nothing to defend myself with. And he taps on the window. He's fixing to come in. This is real. And until you've been there, you realize sometimes the thing that you have to make an alliance with is the thing that could save your life. It's still terrible. It's still a terrible thing to have a weapon of death in the house. It's even more terrible to realize you needed it and you didn't have it at the moment when somebody else plans on doing you harm. And so that's the real horror of life, is the fact that we have to make alliances with the dark and with the unseemly sometimes. That we, not with evil necessarily. For evil is imparted by the holder. But those of us who make our living or try to help other people frequently find ourselves walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and death is on one side and life is on the other. And we're choosing between the two, and both are equally frightening. We have to make choices sometimes, and those choices include things that frighten us, and things that terrify us. That's how we're going to stay alive in a world like this, because this world is a dark and terrifying place. And sometimes we need things that are dark and terrifying to come to our aid.
You know, that's something that just reminded me of what an author said. I forgot which author it was. They said, like one of the many interviews, the 1,000 different authors I was watching, and said, essentially, there's nothing more horrifying than what can happen to you on a daily basis.
That's right.
And that should be the inspiration for a lot of horrors. And in fact, I find to be the inspiration for more so thrillers than horrors, which I kind of prefer a little bit. But thrillers really are themselves, in a way, horrors with a lot less passivity from your main character. That's a thriller right there.
Yeah, the thriller actually brings the reader along to solve the mystery. They're there right then. A lot of times they are there. It's thrilling because the reader becomes a part of it. They're trying to figure out things, and that's that element that's brought in. And that leads us, when we talk about passivity, and I don't want to miss this part, horror in video games. One of the greatest probably genres to capture it is actually video gaming, because it's not passive, but the player is immediately put into the position of being the subject of the horror. And as a result, you have so many great stories, whether it's Fallout, which does have a heavy element of horror in it, or you have Silent Hill. I believe Half-Life is another one. Portals is one that actually has a huge psychological element of horror. That ability to put the reader or the user, the player, in the actual position of confronting the horror themselves, of finding it, of going and seeking it out and seeing it visually, as opposed to just not being able to see it at all, but actually having to confront it.
Definitely.
It's one of the greatest, I think one of the greatest things that ever came out with video gaming actually is the element of horror, because it allows us to interact with it in our own way.
Oh, yeah. Dead by Daylight is a PvP horror where you could go in with your friends and either be the killer or kill them.
Oh my gosh.
But you don't realize how intense it is. You're trying your best to get the stupid generator fixed, and out of nowhere the killer pops out and jump scares your butt.
I think the one in the last, I'd say probably decade now, to do it, like probably peak horror in video games, probably Alien Isolation. Because what makes it so good, or video game horror, is it's actually activating a lot of your senses. You have to be paying attention to what's happening on screen. Your mind's engrafted. Yes. You're in control of the character. But in this particular game, and there's few that do this, but there's a handful that do. The whole shtick of Alien Isolation is you can't kill the alien. The only real thing you can do is run and hide, and maybe lock a door behind you. But you have no way of killing the alien. And if it gets too close to you, you're dead. That's it. It's over. So the entire aspect is getting out of this facility with this alien you can't defeat, who's continuously after you. And now, instead of just reading about a story, you are the story. You're looking through that character's eyes. They go where you lead them to, their life in your hands. And when they die, they have a plethora of cutscenes showing that particular character meeting a terrible fate. And that's the beauty of that type of storytelling that you can get from video games, that heavy interactive storytelling. I know there's a few games that focus solely on horror, but I definitely think that's probably where the future of horror lies if modern day writers can't get a little life in them. But even then, you know, what we're asking of is essentially an entire industry to shift away from what's been selling, because let's be honest, as much as these horror stories that aren't scary kind of frustrate us, they do sell. People do listen to them on YouTube. People do pay attention, and it makes you wonder, you know, maybe the taste for horror has completely shifted from what it used to be.
I think go ahead, Maji. Go ahead.
It doesn't help though that with the horror genre that the slashers took over. They forgot the mind trip part of it and just went straight to the brutal, gruesome violence.
That's do you remember Dead Space, the first game?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that you're right about that. You look at for as an example for this, one of probably the farthest opposite of a slasher is the video game franchise called Siberia. Syberia. Actually, was developed by a Belgian comic artist, video game developer Benoit Sochal, and he created this fantastic adventure game. And the horror itself is not gruesome in that respect, I don't believe, from what I've played of it. It is the uncanny valley. It is the knowing you're in a wrong place and you may be the only person alive except for another human over there. And these others are creatures that you really don't quite understand. It's the uncanny part that makes it so unnerving, that makes it so charming and yet terrifying at the same time. And it is the furthest removed from a slasher where it's immediately in your face, there's blood everywhere, somebody's trying to kill you, to I'm just alone in this world. It feels like loneliness, and at the same time there are creatures moving and I don't understand them. To me, that feeling of uncanniness and of eerie beauty, and married to fear, is something that we have to get back into our grasp. And we've had so many great examples of it, and we do have them today too. I know there's somebody out there listening right now that's going, I've written it. Great. I want you to leave your name in the comments. Tell us who you are. Tell us what you've done, because we need to find you. You guys have the ability to tell stories. You have the amazing gift of telling these stories. And when you've lived it, when you've seen it, when you know it, then share it. And we will find you. Your stories will gain light. So never feel like we're just saying that everybody is bad. What we're saying is the things that get the most attention are the things that sell. Why do they sell? Because somebody else is marketing them. They put them on the shelf and they say, look at this thing. You are indie writers. You have that horror within you. You have that fear that can be made into something palpable that could actually help someone else deal with their own fears in their own lives. Please tell those stories and don't let them escape you. And if you know of good stories, good horror, indie horror that meets that challenge, then let us know in the comments. Talk to us, because we would love to hear about it.
Yeah, we definitely need that. We need more of it.
Yes, indeed. And we are heading on the last 6 minutes. So if there's anything horror-wise somebody's been meaning to get out of them, now's the time.
Maji?
You want to know who the scariest Disney villain is?
Who?
You're going to laugh until you think about it.
What?
It's Gaston.
Really? Why?
Think about it. Gaston is handsome. He grabs the attention of the entire town. Everybody sees him as the man's man, the best man, and the person to be. He can survive in today's world and be real.
John A. Douglas would like a word with you because he loves Gaston. He thinks he's actually the real hero of Beauty and the Beast.
Exactly. He managed to trick an entire town thinking that the man is crazy because she rejected him.
That's true. That is very villainous. He shouldn't have done that part. That was wrong. But
And then he was going to force her to marry him, even though he had 3 blonde hotties constantly bowing at his heels. Gaston is by far the scariest villain because he is real. He could be in the real life. He could be in politics. He could do anything real nonstop in our society today. And be just as twisted and evil.
And here's the beautiful part, Maji. When each of us tells the others what we truly fear, we're talking about our own lives and what actually scares us the most. What scares us the most are the monsters we don't recognize, or the people we don't see, that may be actually good people sometimes, but could also be dangerous or harmful. There's a true terror in that.
Yeah,
and so when each of us talks about what scares us the most, that's actually what we're talking about. Our horror belongs to us, and we are sharing it. And that is the revelation of the author that is the most terrifying part about being a horror author, is you are telling other people what you fear the most. And you're
I think if you were to do that, because I think a lot of them don't. They don't write what they're afraid of the most. And if they did, if they're experienced enough, they'd know how to wrap that up in a terrifying, mythological, cryptid-esque creature. But a lot of them are writing about what they think you should fear, what they think you're afraid of. But they need to do that. That's where the best of literature comes from, especially in horror. It's a very personal genre, horror. I'd say it's probably just as personal as probably romance. And we need more people to be able to look inward towards their pain and say, how can I fashion this in a way to display it to others where they can see the pain, they could feel the pain, they could be afraid of the pain, where it could become a real, fearful, physical visage that's worthy of it, that exists. And that's where it's missing out. I don't believe anything in these stories exists. I'm not afraid of any of it.
Wow, that was deep, James.
It's true. It's true.
In my work, I think maybe mummies.
Ooh. Why?
The undead, powerful undead mummies.
But these are different. These are special Star Shatter mummies.
Ooh.
Because Egypt is somewhat different. Well, in many ways, a lot, quite different. Yeah, that's Maji. You will read this part in the second anthology. You read this story in the second anthology. I think you got it. You got the book. Yeah, so you.
I have the book. I haven't read the second one. I got the first one done. I haven't read the second one.
This one is quite. It has these almost Diablo-esque style horror, but it's not quite the same, of course.
And with that, we're running up on our final minutes. So everybody, it's a checkout time. Where can they find your stuff? Let's start with Maji this time.
Yay!
Well, I don't really have anything.
Yes, you do.
So, sorry.
You're working on your book over there.
Yeah, you're working on your book.
It's a long ways in progress.
But
I'm
you
about
aren't.
2/3 of the way of the second draft, so it's still got about a draft and a quarter, or it's quarter fetch, draft and the third to
There
go.
you go.
But
Yay.
yeah, I sometimes hang out in a drink with Crazy, and also on the Wrangler's channel as well, so you can see
Yes.
me there.
Roger.
You're a celebrity.
But no,
Yeah, I get
just whenever my work schedule's available. But no, yeah, feel free to check him out. Also, check out Skunk's workshop. He's doing a
Woo!
piece for me for the story.
Oh, that's
So,
awesome.
oh yeah, there he is, right there. I didn't even know he was still
Yay!
But yeah, no, Skunks is actually drawing one of my scenes for me,
That is
and
so amazing.
so we're thinking. I'm thinking I might be putting some illustrations in the book. Not very many,
So
you know,
cool.
kind of like how traditional books had like 5 or 6 randomly throughout the stories.
I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So we're thinking of doing that.
Excellent.
It's a
Sounds
great
fun.
idea.
That's so
All right,
amazing.
Black Knight, where can the people find you?
You can find me. You can find my books on Amazon. All of the Star Shattered series books, the 2 anthologies, Mandate of Sword and Railgun, and the Blood of Tyrants, and the 2 Conan-esque style shortish heroic pulp novels about Valiant the Ultorian, and my brand new 100% old school pulp fantasy Lord
hey,
of
there's Wrangler.
Bones, yes, which is you can also find on Amazon. And currently I'm running a promo on it, a sale. It's 1.5 weeks left for the Kindle. Yeah,
You got the Amazon link down below in the details. Comments.
Yes. And you can find me on Substack and the Black Knight.
Excellent. And how about you, RH Snow?
watcherthedam.com or at flow.page/rhsnow. That's flow.page/rhsnow, where you can find Watcher the Damned. It starts off with a horror scene with a ghost and a mysterious child. We have fields of bone. We have vast fields of death in this world, for death is everywhere. And yet there is also beauty. And so there's an eerie quality to it. Those who have talked about it, it is primarily supernatural, but it is also the physical death that surrounds them and their inability to really weave it into their own lives and how they have to deal with it every day in a number of different ways. Monsters and ghosts, and also the real horror of people we love becoming something we don't want them to be. So if you love things that scare you to death, read Watcher of the Damned with RH Snow. And thank you for letting me be here today. This was so cool. I love all of y'all so much.
I love you too, Snow. Can I do one correction real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I am not on A Drink with Crazy. I'm not affiliated with him. I hang out in his chat, but he's still a cool
There you
YouTuber, guys. Check him out.
All right. And I'm James Esparza. I'm the guy pressing all the buttons in the background. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm a short story writer. You can check out all my stuff at worldwithoutendlore.substack.com. I'm currently writing a novella, so I haven't written a short story in a little while, but I'm currently working on one to release next month. It's going to be a horror short story. So you can go ahead and judge it for yourself if I hold up to all the stuff I've been saying. And
It's
you
quite
can have
nice.
That's going to be coming out next month. But with all that, thank you all for joining us. We are headed out for the evening. Have yourself a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye now, world. We're out of here.